Our speaker tonight is going to talk, the topic is Facing Apocalypse, Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances. Just a moment to talk about what she's going to talk about. She's going to talk about her book, Facing Apocalypse. And it is, a reflection on the last book of the Christian Bible, but she's going to do it in such a way that sort of looks at both what that meant and what it means for future times. I think this is going to be a really exciting talk. So let me talk about our speaker. Catherine, the speaker for this evening is Catherine Keller. She is she's a professor of constructive theology in the Theological School and Graduate Division of Religion of Drew University. She teaches courses in process, political and ecological theology. Within and beyond Christian conversation, she has all along mobilized the transdisciplinary potent of feminist, philosophical, and pluralist intersections with religion. Her most recent books invite at once both a contemplative and a social critique of our entangled existence, and the most recent one of which is The Facing Apocalypse, but there are others, Incarnations, On the Possibility of Theology, Cloud of the Impossible, Negative Theology, and Planetary Entanglements, and many others in her cadre of books that she's written. We are really excited to have her talk tonight. So with this, let me welcome Catherine and remind everybody again that if you have questions and answers, put them in the Q&A, and you can start putting them in at any time, and we will we'll receive them. Catherine, please get started.
Thank you, Gail. And I also want to say I'm very appreciative of Maynard Moore's communicative initiative in arranging this webinar, and CJ Love behind the scenes is making it work. And I am suspensefully thankful that Rabbi Fred Daub has agreed to be my respondent. And I am grateful as well for all of you who have turned up for something called Facing Apocalypse. I don't know that I would. Why join a Zoom just to hear about doom? Doom of either climate or democracy. And in the wake of COP26, well, that's a good word, wake. The needed wake-up call threatens to morph into something more like the wake before a funeral. But instead of plunging into that affect, I will start by sharing the bit of Shakespearean wit that Maynard mentioned in the invitation, since it does open my Facing Apocalypse. Hamlet says, "What news?" And Rosencrantz responds, "None, my lord, but that the world's grown honest." Hamlet says, "Then is doomsday near." So let's keep Hamlet's irony near. He's not announcing the end of the world, but the disturbing connection between honesty and apocalyptic disclosure. And that was, in a certain sense, the point of my book, that apocalypse does not mean the end, not final closure, but present disclosure. I wrote the book because we are not going to quit hearing references to climate doom. So that means that we are not likely in our lifetimes to get away from the apocalypse, from the word, the symbol, the echoes of an ancient text. Now, if it were just a born again, Jesus is coming soon apocalypse, maybe we could just ignore it. Nothing new there. Nor, on the other hand, if it means a more recent sort of secularist, we're doomed determinism, often about global warming, and often scientifically informed. Either way, not much point in arguing. So we might just write off the apocalypse as cliche, an overused trope of a "we're saved, praise the Lord" denialism, or then again of the "too late, why bother" nihilism. Either way, self-fulfilling prophecies of doom are spinning around in and out of religion, between a junk optimism and a paralyzing pessimism. Honestly, I thought I'd left such work behind in the last millennium with my book, Apocalypse Now and Then, subtitled A Feminist Guide to the End of the World. And yes, the irony of the now and then did target the single telos endpoint of the apocalyptic mythos. It sought to dissipate or to deconstruct the whole linear sense of history roaring to a determinate goal through Christian doom or modern progress, not climate nihilism, but scientific secular optimism. I found in these opposites a resiliently adaptive male supremacism. But I'd imagined a fresh millennium might liberate itself from both the Christian interplay of supernatural hope and denialism, and from the secularized spiral between optimism and pessimism. I had hoped that in this millennium, I could leave the apocalypse to biblical scholars of that ancient text written in the form of 7 letters. But it soon enough became clear to me that I needed to return to the Isle of Patmos, that I needed to write a book in the form of 7 chapters with 7 sections each that would address the strange resonances of the text with current apocalyptic processes, and that would reach beyond academic and Christian readerships, I hoped. For there will continue a proliferation of apocalyptic pronouncements, and some of them cannot be written off. They don't all belong to the vicious circle of denialism and nihilism. Some are using the sign of apocalypse differently, with a serious relation to science. For instance, as I began to write the book, the so-called insect Armageddon in Europe and the insect apocalypse in the Americas were buzzing in my brain. Due to climate change and agribusiness chemicals, the insect population has plunged precipitously in the 3 continents studied, and it is the basis for the whole food chain, not to mention crop pollination, those insects. The entomological message was not that it is now simply too late. The point is more creepy and crawly. It is to reveal a catastrophic danger to our collective situation so that we might face it and just possibly respond to it responsibly. These examples endlessly multiply. During the 2020 fire season, the LA Times headline flashed a couple of times a version of "A climate apocalypse now. Climate change is only worsening the record-breaking wildfires, heat and air pollution in California and the West." And that was the year before the unthinkable worsening of the fires over the past half year. Again, the point of such journalism is not game over, California is toast, but wake up. The situation exceeds the natural and needed cycle of wildfires. Catastrophe is kicking in for the long haul. It does not add up to the end of the habitable world or even of California, yet it might, short of adequate speed and scale of response to climate change. So the empirical reality of climate change will assure a secular public rhetoric of apocalypse for the foreseeable future. And some of it will use the notion of apocalypse responsibly. The biblical term apocalypsis does not mean the end. It means unveiling, eye-opening, which is never comfortable, but it discloses. It does not merely close down. There is no flat end of the world anywhere in the Bible. Many endings, yes. And as the Brazilian scholars Danowski and Viveiros de Castro remind us, thinking not of the Bible, but of indigenous peoples in their work titled The Ends of the World, many, many worlds end, but they don't add up to the end of the world. In the Bible, there are mass destructions, human and non-human, but no totality of termination. Under pressure of collective crisis, new possibilities may open up. And it is because we won't escape such pressures, I figured more of us need to spend a bit more time with the apocalypse itself, the old one. No mere metaphor, but a metaphors. Of course, it is not only climate change that is evoking apocalypse. Speaking of evocative, watch for J. Cameron Carter's book, The Religion of Whiteness, an apocalyptic lyric. It's coming soon. It discloses with the poetic of radical disclosure the layers of systemic destruction that have sacralized white supremacism as the condition of civilization itself. Or let me cite my old friend, Rita Nakashima-Brock, whom I always knew to be allergic to any hint of apocalyptic discourse. She wrote the following in response to January 6. As I watched news reports of the violence deep into the night, I had the unsettling thought that I was watching a national apocalypse unfold. Thoughts about apocalypse had been on my mind as the pandemic surged and George Floyd's murder captured global attention, igniting the largest social movement in US history. Like most critical thinkers, Rita Brock had always resisted apocalyptic thinking, in part because right-wing evangelicals predictably use it to deflect all challenges to their white male supremacy. And of course, that edge of reactionary Christian apocalypse was in play among the conspiracy cults like QAnon that helped fire up that January round of Trumpocalypse. Trumpocalypse, by the way, is a term coined as a title of a book by McGuire and Anderson to Trump supporters. Rita now deploys apocalypse with hermeneutical precision to mean not the end of the world, but great crisis with revelatory impact. And the way the issues mount up, crises of COVID, race, climate, foments an intersectionalism of apocalypse. For instance, Jacqueline Patterson, who heads the climate justice group for the NAACP, which has embraced climate action as crucial to racial justice, put it this way in a recent Time article by Justin Moreland, who's the African-American journalist who heads the magazine's environmental reporting. He writes, economy, food, housing, transit, all of these are civil rights issues, and climate issues intersect with every single one. Such intersectionalism unveils the extent of US white supremacist exceptionalism. And at the same time, it challenges the single issue politics of progressive versions of exceptionalism. Of course, the intersectionality of issues can overwhelm, can lose focus, can feel impossible. But at the same time, it unveils the chance for solidarities broad enough to alter the world, at least the chance. Still, what does such revealing intersectionality have to do with the archaic imagery of the Book of Revelation? That old letter did not foresee racism, neoliberal capitalism, or its carbon emissions, democracy, or its demise. As my book is at pains to insist, John of Patmos was not predicting the facts of any future. Prophecy in the biblical tradition does not signify prediction of facts. Prophets discern civilizational patterns entrenched so deeply that they are likely to last way too long. Prophecy, according to my book, is a kind of radical dream reading, which in turn invites our dream reading of the text. Those patterns are encoded for John as the two beasts of sea and land, signifying the global power of the Roman Empire, and as the whore of Babylon, code for Rome's version of global trade, hence the 28 luxury commodities John lists as no longer available when she falls. Jewels, purple dye, wine, etc., and climactically, slaves. The merchants, John intones, were the magnates of the earth. When I worked on the image of Babylon in the last millennium, I was fixated on the misogyny of this image of a royal whore. And John's misogyny cannot be erased. But in this round, I couldn't avoid John's point, and that meant dream reading his imperial porn queen as ancestor of the lascivious desire globally cultivated by neo-imperial capitalism. Of course, politics and economics have undergone great shifts in 2000 years, some promisingly anti-imperial. But might we agree that a civilizational pattern of global power and transnational greed have brought us to our present edge? And on that edge, global warming is also dream readable in John. The seventh seal opens after a dramatic pause and then is revealed 1/3 of the trees of the earth burning, 1/3 of the life of the sea dying, etc. And an eagle lamenting, alas, alas, to all the inhabitants of the earth. The inhabitants include all the planet's living creatures. In the face of mass extinction, is the eagle voicing what is now called eco-grief? And she later cries out, now is the time for the destruction of the destroyers of the earth. Not for the destruction of the earth, as fundamentalists like to read it, a convenient misreading, as so many right-wing Christians unconditionally support the economic structures currently destroying the earth. So I felt that this archaic tumult of symbols matters now because it keeps on materializing, not because it is necessarily so wise and true. The biblical apocalypse is not Torah and it is not gospel, and it must not distract from climate science or anti-racist education or LGBTQI struggles. It is just that I realized that more of us who are concerned with the public effects of religious symbols need to face that ancient apocalypse. First of all, as a meditation to help face our own fears of coming doom. More of us, not just academics and not just Christians, may want to face the political theology of apocalypse. Its messianic anti-imperialism, its warning of a mounting spiral of planetary destruction, its bitterly righteous, hideously violent vision, as well as its multinational post-imperial urban utopia, the New Jerusalem. So I hope that an exercise in dream reading the apocalypse can help to surface potentials working unconsciously and collectively, not as timeless archetypes, but as timeful potentialities. By minding those metaforces, both reactionary and revolutionary, both destructive and constructive, both sacralized and secularized, we might reconfigure their effects. This is not so that some glittering New Jerusalem will finally come down from heaven. But maybe the metaphors of apocalypse can help enliven the fragile and down-to-earth hope of communal life, even urban life, transformed transnationally and renewed ecologically, of planetary health, human, and so much more than human. It's a hope that cannot be confused with optimism, even in a temporarily friendlier United States, even with the good COP signal of US and Chinese cooperation on emissions. The challenges to democracy, let alone climate, are not diminishing. The old apocalyptic utopia might refresh our immediate struggles with a sip of its water of life, which it insistently offers as free of charge for all. We will not escape the challenges, some collectively traumatic, but we might together bear with them. The specter of the end of time might twist and break into more inviting possibilities in time even to avoid 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, despite the apparent fact, and what a bizarre fact it is, that currently the rate of warming of the ocean is equivalent to the explosion of 5 nuclear warheads every second. The overheated specter of apocalypse won't go away. It may, though, help to unveil possibilities for swift and sane transformation in the face of the cruel facts. These possibilities do sparkle in the dark of improbability. Some appear to be last chances, but perhaps still real chances. At least that's the particular lens my facing apocalypse fits onto the ancient text as a perspective on now and here. In the present context, I'd like to back away from that discourse of urgency for my final minutes and take advantage of the opportunity to situate the book in its wider theological context. It's the deep width or the wide depth of theology that's pretty much what drove me into this discipline in the first place. My own theological perspective might seem to be dominated by a preoccupation with the beginning and the end, that is, with Genesis and Apocalypse. Hence, my 1996 Apocalypse Now and Then, and 2021 Facing Apocalypse, and in between, Face of the Deep, a theology of becoming, which is one long interpretation of really Genesis 1-2. It was a 2003 volume, cautiously welcoming a new millennium. But my brooding over beginnings and endings expressed mainly a desire to question them, or more accurately, to unveil, disclose the Christian readings that gradually, post-biblically, forced the creation into a linear history from absolute beginning to absolute termination, with the incarnation as high point. So Face of the Deep hovers for too many pages, far too many pages in the darkness over that oceanic depth. It follows the biblical scholarship that has had to avow, sometimes ruefully, that there is no absolute beginning in Genesis or anywhere else biblical. No simple creation from nothing. The paradigm of creatio ex nihilo comes into its own post-biblically, gelling especially with Irenaeus as key to his anti-Gnostic argument on behalf of the omnipotent power of the Creator to dominate all creatures. But Genesis 1-2 itself depicts nothing like mere nothingness existing prior to the 7 days. There's the earth, tohu vabohu, unformed and uninhabitable, the darkness over the face of the Tehom, the spirit vibrating, meheraphet, over the face of the Mayim. Thus, Norbert Samuelson refutes the legitimacy of deriving the ex nihilo from either the Hebrew or rabbinic heritage. No, nothing there. In place of the non-biblical formulation of creatio ex nihilo, I suggested a creatio ex profundis. This came in conversation with scholar of religion and of Talmud, Daniel Boyarin. But this creation from the Tehom was not motivated only by biblical hermeneutics to offer an alternative theology to the ex nihilo. I was extending what I had learned from process theology, indeed from clues in Alfred North Whitehead, as to a God of beginningless and endless creativity, and therefore of a creation without any likely single origin or endpoint. Particular worlds, planets, galaxies, and perhaps universes may come and go, but the creative process of the cosmos and its materialization of possibility precedes and exceeds each of those worlds. Whitehead was thinking prior to the idea of the multiverse, but his paradigm may be updated by what Mary Jane Rubenstein analyzes in Worlds Without End, as in, for instance, the models of a fractal multiverse or Smolin's evolutionary universe. New possibilities are thereby opened up by meditation on the Tehom, that oceanic abyss of potentiality. One reads then against, for instance, Karl Barth, who saw the darkness of Genesis 1-2 as evil, and so desperately read the verse as a satire of pagan notions of creation from the chaos. And consider how differently history might appear if we had sustained some vision of creation from chaos, not from mere disorder, but out of the potential for manifold orders, for fresh form, for a collective becoming of a world in which the earth and the waters continue to participate in the creation, and we in that troubled imago Dei would foster cooperation with the creatures inorganic and organic. If we had heeded such clues as Rabbi Rashi's 1,000 years ago, who said, the text does not intend to point out the order of the acts of creation, to state that these, heaven and earth, were created first. In the face of such nonlinearity, the hierarchies of civilizational top-down order, social and economic, wouldn't have divinized themselves quite so conclusively. It would not be a matter of worshiping chaos as the alternative, but of minding its potentiality. Chaos and complexity theory should have, and perhaps yet will help with the revelation that complex order unfolds at the edge of chaos, not over the edge, but also not in retreat to mere order. And with such theology, spirituality, we perhaps feel less fear in the face of complexities and indeterminacies. We might take heart in the knowledge that we are beginning always again, now and now. And we would be called to response, to responsibility, by the awareness that what we sometimes call God is not in control, is not an omnipotent hyperlord, but a depth that calls to us, a width that unfolds us. The deity that Whitehead, the mathematician, and PK helps to articulate works by the divine lure of a new possibility and by the compassion that enfolds what we, all creatures, do actualize moment by moment. This is not the unmoved, but the most moved mover. Such a divinity is also in Genesis, in becoming. Its constitutive relationality lured me 40 years ago into this life of theology because of its potential for a feminist ontology of radical relation. And yes, Hamlet, the irony of becoming a theologian, honestly, particularly a Christian one, was not lost on me. For most feminist theology remained, and perhaps still does remain, a mere oxymoron. So theology won't fix our problems for us, not of democracy, not of climate change. And yet we might together hear and heed what is calling to us from our depths and breadths and discern possibilities that reopen time. So then the movement of a line from alpha to omega twists and spirals into something other, something endlessly more complicating, implicating than a timeline, and always in need of fresh explicating. This is perhaps all a way of exegeting Revelation's I am the Alpha and the Omega, not as a claim to all controlling power, not as a gesture of Christian supremacism, but of the creative logos of each moment, the initial possibility and the consequent embrace of each becoming existence, moment by moment. For the joint present tense of that I am, that Alpha and Omega, already deconstructs the model of a pure beginning way back sometime, and of the eschatological closure coming, always coming soon. Eschaton means edge, not merely end, the prophetic edginess of history rather than the one end time. An eschatology edged with an apocalypse of disclosure, not closure, disclosing myriad endings, some unbearable, endless, unnecessary, non-human torments and species, extinctions, and lives ending hellishly for vast human populations. And other endings folding peaceably into the vibrancy of future becomings. The possibility of something like the kingdom of heaven with us this day, the possibility. And as for the creation, it goes on, as far as we know, through whatever extinction spasms on this planet soon, and perhaps also through the heat deaths of a particular universe, creatio ad infinitum. That does not let us off the hook for saving what we can of this little earth world of ours. On the contrary, it only intensifies our particular responsibility. And so this meditation with beginnings and endings deconstructs the single origin and endpoint of a timeline in order to open up the dynamism of Alpha and Omega, fresh possibility and present realization, dissolving time not into timeless eternal presences of the moment, but into entangled relations of becoming. So it does foster a sense of possibility, no matter what. Yet an edge of Hamlet's irony remains. if we are honest, we do face climate doom, precisely not as the end, but as disclosure. And honest disclosure never loses its edge of uncertainty. There's an apophatic cloud surrounding the edge. So an ancient Christian mystical tradition, known sometimes as apophatic or negative theology, borrowed the dark cloud in which the unspeakable I am comes to Moses on Mount Sinai. That cloud enfolded me in the work of the 15th century Nicholas of Cusa in what he called the cloud of the impossible. With Cusa, a cosmology of radical relationality comes into full articulation, perhaps for the first time, at least in Europe. Because all is in all, he says, and each thing is in each thing, therefore God is in all, and all are in God. Intriguingly, his relational cosmology led him to formulate from the infinity of God, the boundlessness of the universe. And from that lack of circumference, he conjectures the lack of any center. He infers, therefore, that the earth is not the center, nor is any star. He anticipates by a century Copernicus's infinite universe and moving earth, but goes way beyond Copernicus's heliocentrism. For Cusa, there is no fixed center. So one may note with a certain irony the interplay of apophatic mysticism and a proto-scientific genius in Cusa. So his cloud of the impossible became the name of my book on the theological interplay of unknowing and entanglement, relational entanglement. Though of course I am not a science and religion scholar, I could not avoid a little bit of meditation on how the science of quantum uncertainty yielded the theory of entanglement, spooky action at a distance, a dark cloud of revelation for physicists. The cloud of unknowing edges an irreducible uncertainty from electron to elephant to election. So the darkness over the face of the deep is a darkness of unknowing, but also of indeterminacy with its open ends. For Cusa, the cloud signified an impossibility that yields a new possibility if one courageously enters that cloud. Not unlike Derrida's possible impossibility of the impossible, the possible impossibility of the im/possible. So perhaps theologically, it is the matter of creatio ex profundis et ad infinitum. In conclusion, not the end, but an end of my talk, the apocalypse goes reflexive, as perhaps the apocalypse of theology itself. Honesty requires it. Some gesture toward the doom felt by so many mainstream religious institutions, now moving along in a weird coincidence of timing with climate crisis. And to be honest, the irony doesn't dissipate in the face of the Christian right on the one hand, and on the other, the death of God. To do an alternative theology, a theology for an age of science, at least of the responsible science trying to rescue the world from COVID-19, from climate catastrophe, perhaps that remains a valuable strategy in face of that right-wing denialism, and perhaps almost as valuable in the face of secular nihilism. The problem is not skepticism or atheism as such, but perhaps the deployment of the now aging metaphor of the death of God as its own kind of certainty. The death of God at the level of creative metonymy is not more knowably assured than is the death of Earth's ecology. The apocalypsis we need does not reveal certainty. It dream reads clouded possibility. If we must predict with any certitude where things are headed, that means a prediction based on current trends. The status quo prospects for avoiding more than 1.5 centigrade rise are, of course, a bit doom and gloomy. But that certitude remains in all Hamlet's honesty larded with indeterminacy. And into that indeterminacy, the possible enters, such as the possibility of eco-civilization, which you will, I understand, discuss with Philip Clayton next month. He will not persuade you that eco-civ is on its way, but that it has a chance. Our planetary future's uncertainty is an opening, a disclosure, an apocalypsis of its own, and a call to us all. Strange, ironic even, how hope in our time comes down to uncertainty, comes down wrapped in a dense cloud of the impossible. And after that dense cloud of discourse, I want to thank you for your patient listening, and I look very much forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. That was just fabulous, really exciting talk. Now I'd like to introduce our respondent, who is Rabbi Fred Sherlinder Dobb. Rabbi Fred was ordained from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and he is now the rabbi. First, he's a full-time rabbi at Adat Shalom. He's done a lot of work, and I could actually probably spend as long as he's going to talk describing him. I'll just say a few things. He serves as chair of the National Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. He's on the boards of both the National Religious Partnership for the Environment and Interfaith Power and Light. He does a lot of work on multi-faith, multi-racial justice, and Israeli progressive efforts. It's really my joy to welcome Rabbi Fred to this session and to invite him to give his response.
Honored to be with you all, and incredibly honored to be called to this response. I am more a practitioner than a scholar, and as such, I feel like we should do some deep breathing and some singing together to let Dr. Keller's incredible words and concepts sink in. That's not the format tonight, but just a quick moment of channeling the attitude of gratitude that is so central to a religious life and also to a sustainable life, so that we can celebrate what we have rather than always feeling that we need more. Just a moment to sit with that gratitude. So a few very quick and very partial thoughts to introduce a little bit of additional Jewish angle, although Dr. Keller is very lowercase c Catholic in her teaching and covered the waterfront there, and very grateful for that. So first is, I'm a big fan of the number 7, as was John of Patmos. And of course, 7 as this archetype for creation. But the count of 7s measured in years has actually been kept ever since temple days, as long as Revelations has been around. And this Hebrew year, 5782, is the sabbatical year, or Shemitah, which literally means radical release. It was never fully practiced as described in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, but it's there as a lodestar of values: the need to stay resilient and interdependent, just and inclusive and sustainable. To be ready for anything, ready for periodic disruptions, every 7th year, cessation of formal agriculture, or every 100 or so years, a massive epidemic that shuts everything down. We are not ready because we have lost the messages in so many ways of this tradition. Again, never fully practiced as described, but it's a rough map toward a better world, toward tikkun olam, literally the repair of a broken world. That famous phrase, tikkun olam, is itself messianic, repairing the breach within the divine unity. It was described in the wake of the Spanish expulsion and the Portuguese massacres, 1492, 1497, reflective of the breach of exile and dislocation here on Earth, which is now only getting worse, alas, as the number of climate refugees grows with no sign of retreating. Jewish thought is all over the place vis-a-vis messianism. At times, my ancestors have held out very clear hope, and even at times believing it's right around the corner, but very often pushing it to the background with a disproportionate focus on the here and now. And here and now, boy, do we have work to do. Tikkun Olam in liberal Judaism today picks up on an ancient approach of what I think of as gradual messianism, an alternate that is very compatible with Dr. Keller's interpretations, although not necessarily with a one narrow reading of this particular book from the later Testament. Gradual messianism is where we simply work to create a world with all the 2 steps forward and 1 step back involved, where one day our descendants will be able to wake up and say, wow, that was harrowing, but now the ecosystem is stable, society is reasonably whole, people are flawed but awesome, institutions and structures are imperfect but self-healing. Maybe this is the Messianic age. The first chief Ashkenazic rabbi of pre-state Palestine, Rav Kook, famously issued every address, Chalutzim of the Messiah, right? You are the pioneers of the Messiah because you are building something that matters, something that hopefully makes our people and the world better. That's for another talk. But that idea introduces the asymptote, right? And so building on some of the amazing references across science and math, as well as theology and literature, the asymptote, as many of us know, is the line that a curve gradually approaches but never quite gets to. So if God is perfect and our goal is to become ever more perfect, we will never be perfect, but as we become more godly and as we make a society whose sustainability and justice is ever better, then as time goes by and we approach that x-axis, we get better and better. We never become the same with it, but we keep closing the gap by another half, another half, another half, until the difference is literally infinitesimal. That is my personal view of messianism. It is maybe a rosy-eyed optimistic view, but there you have it. And it's deeply attested in many Jewish sources, although just as with Christianity, certainly does not speak with one voice. 2 more thoughts. We learned that apocalypse might be a, quote, overused trope of we're saved, praise the Lord denialism, or then again, if it's too late, why bother nihilism? And either way, these self-fulfilling prophecies of doom are spinning around in and out of religion, and I love this phrase, I'm only quoting Dr. Keller here, between a junk optimism and a paralyzing pessimism. And we need to thread that needle. So enter here emet, the Hebrew word for truth, which is drawn from the first, middle, and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's our alpha to omega, quite literally. Developed in Jewish thought to mean the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The whole truth needs to be there because we too easily will shirk the inconvenient truths, as Al Gore would frame it. Those where we'd prefer to be ostriches, the truths that if internalized would compel tough, major, discomforting changes. But of course, without our making these changes, enormous ones here and now, the future will be tougher and more dangerous still. So echoing Dr. Keller's appreciation for your all being here and thinking about all this, thank you even more for your next steps, for the ratcheting up of your own climate ambition. The denialism extreme is probably not well represented in a crowd gathered for IRAS. If you believe in those letters, you probably are not a climate denier ipso facto, but many of us in different ways will succumb to the too late, why bother nihilism. Or for many in our communities, we might put it a little more subtly, it's overwhelming and I'm just a tiny part, so I'll do a little bit, but I'm not ready to make those fundamental shifts I kind of know I should. And to that, I share the Torah from Dr. Ruth Messenger of American Jewish World Service, a leading activist in our community. We cannot afford the luxury of feeling overwhelmed. We must never succumb to feeling disempowered. She echoes here what the emerging field of climate communications tells us, and go to the Yale or George Mason or other wonderful repositories about this. The best messaging boils down to, it's real, it's bad, it's us, and there's hope. This idea of removing the blinders and seeing the whole truth connects to Jewish theology at many points. It also comes straight back to apocalypse. As we learned tonight, the biblical term apocalypsis does not mean the end, it means unveiling, eye-opening, which is never comfortable. But it discloses, it does not merely close down. So keep your eyes open and seek to help others' eyes be open too. And my final thought, picking up on hope. Hope that comes down to uncertainty, comes down wrapped in a dense cloud. Today's efforts are quite simply to try and save as many people, ecosystems, and species as we can along the way. It's bad, it's getting worse. We've lost much and we will lose more. It is already too late for many people, many species, many peoples, many ecosystems, decades into the future, even in the best scenarios. But it's not yet too late for others. The White House science advisor, John Holdren, in 2010, put this so powerfully. We have only three options. One is mitigation, the steps we take to reduce the pace and magnitude of the changes in climate our activities cause. The second is adaptation, the measures we take to reduce the harm that results from climate change that we do not avoid. And the third option is suffering. It's really that simple: mitigation, adaptation, suffering. We're already doing some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be going forward. The more we mitigate, the less we need to adapt and the less suffering. The more we do adaptation, the less suffering. But some of all three is already baked in. We're trying to expand and preserve what quality of life can be maintained by as many people as possible for as long as possible. We're trying to rapidly bring down emissions, that's mitigation, ramp up readiness, resilience, that's adaptation, and again, Shemitah and other biblical examples of drawing on insight from our ancients. And we're doing this so as to minimize future suffering. That is a rather wan hope. It is a clouded hope. It is, as Dr. Keller says, a dream reading of clouded possibility, but it's true hope still. So let's go forward together with actions informed by Dr. Keller's wisdom, and let's keep that hope alive. Let's be the hope. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fred. Those were great comments. What we usually do at this point is give Catherine the chance to respond back to anything that she might want. So Catherine, you don't feel obligated, but we're happy to have you respond if you want to.
I will not feel obligated. Thank you. I'm feeling very grateful for this emet spoken by the remarkable Rabbi Fred Dobbs. And I am not going to properly respond to his response. I just want to pick up on that theme of hope, because it is really in danger, isn't it, among thinking people, among the people who we need to be really mobilizing their minds and their resources and their communities to fight climate change, et cetera. And the cynicism is a great danger. And so anything of the sort that we heard the rabbi just unfold to us about Jewish messianism and getting better, possibility that we're getting better and better, and that we'll get to this world that's flawed but awesome, can so quickly get dismissed in a lot of these thinking circles as just naive optimism. So I really think it's good to keep meditating on that problem. And I find it crucial to distinguish between optimism and hope. And here's one of the only places I actually quote happily and with agreement, Karl Barth. Mostly, as in my paper, I'm just bitching at him, but old patriarch. But this I totally agree with. He said, as Christians, we're not optimists or pessimists. We're hopeful. And I find that very helpful in teaching my seminarians, for instance. But just everyone needs to understand that. And this is just for Christians if you're talking just to Christians, but this is clearly very much, I think, reverberating with Fred's meditation. That hope simply isn't the same thing as optimism. The hope of the Jewish tradition is profound and rigorous and carries eons of suffering in its memory. There's no cheap optimism there. Hope is simply not that. So I just recommend rhetorically always making a distinction between optimism and hope, because hope takes nothing for granted. It carries the grief of millennia within itself. And so, no, I don't hear, of course, rosy-eyed optimism here. I hear very, very rigorous hope in this teaching of a gradual messianism. I'm really glad to be learning more now about the asymptote. That's beautiful that we can keep approaching it. That doesn't say that we are, does it? There's no sense that because the messianism in play would be that of a gradual unfolding and growth in faith and practice. That doesn't mean we are in that gradual process, or perhaps it means that some of us are, or some clusters of us are. There are pockets of history that break through. I just wonder how we can connect that messianic gradualism with the much more interrupted, but not totally non-existent gradual evolution of practices of responsibility, of ethics, of value, of sustainability in our civilization. I'd love to just hear more thinking about that. But what seems really important in what you're saying is that there is a radical transforming kind of what historical energy, the energy of this messianism that can help carry our struggle when we lose faith, when we veer towards pessimism, not because we can suddenly get rosy-eyed, but because we can understand that this tikkun olam is very very rigorous, historically profound, and tragically impeded work. But as long as there are signs of it, and conversations like this with groups like this are clear signs of it, there's simply no excuse for the why bother. Anyway, I just want to say also thank you for connecting Emmett to Alpha and Omega. That's very cool. And I'll be at my Omega now.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I mean, Fred, do you want to make any comments?
I'll stay at my Taf, the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet that ends Emet. Thank you so much. Beautiful additional observations, and looking forward to hearing what comes from the wisdom of the larger community in the questions.
Amen.
Great. Thanks to you both. This was really a fabulous discussion. Maynard, you have your hand up. You are a host, so you get the first pop at a question if you want one.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on the economic question. Usually because economics is a driver in all of these social issues, and certainly on the political scene. In your book, in chapter 5, you reference the German economist Wolfgang Streeck, who has identified what he calls 3 long-term trends affecting the decline of capitalism, but the decline of the Western democracies that are built on capitalism. He identifies what he calls the 3 horsemen of apocalypse: stagnation. This is economic stagnation, debt, and inequality. You point out that the 4th horseman is missing in his analysis. Would you not say that the 4th horseman of this apocalyptic emergency that we're facing might be climate change denial across the world? Not, but, particularly in this country, but denial in the sense of not willing to make the economic institutional adjustments that are going to be required, because in a real sense, it's been capitalism that has been driving us into this quagmire. I would like to just have your more thoughts on the economic drivers behind this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. There's nothing more powerful driving this crisis than the particular form of global economic capitalism that we have now in its neoliberal form. And yes, yes, you're right. That's the 4th horseman. Surely is, or is the horse climate change and the rider the denial that's actually riding it onward and driving it upward into ever greater levels of destruction. And so that's why it's crucial that some of us, even in theology and religious studies, touch base sometimes with thinkers in economics to try to help break through this kind of cultural logjam. Now, for me, it wouldn't be about coming up with alternative economic theories, but listening for them. But first of all, it's working theologically in communities of faith to challenge those great collective patterns of greed that are carrying us, working in whichever communities we find voice to find ways to challenge an economic order that is really held as almost unquestionable, right, by either party. The Democrats would modify it and constrain capitalism a little bit more, by constrain it democratically, hold it to certain forms of social responsibility. But it's a very hard model to challenge. I don't think we have time right now to first aim to bring down global capitalism and then really get to work on climate change, right? We have about a decade, so we have to work within the economic systems that we have, but we have to work with our eyes apocalyptically wide open that it is this economic system that our nations, our societies are fully invested in, that is bringing down the possibility of a habitable earth for us in the future, and to get at the at the economics of it theologically, of course, is that's why I was backed into the corner with the Whore of Babylon, which is really a no-no image if you're a feminist. And I had helped to make it a no-no image in my 96 book. It was like to use the image of a sex worker this way just seemed to me so insulting of women. And yes, that's true. But it's a very powerful image, from within an ancient patriarchal context for getting at the utterly seductive voracity of this system. And so I thought one had to give it some attention. And the fact that this apocalyptic author did recognize the global economy as very literally global there with the two beasts, and very much described in terms of global trade, right? With that list of 28 products that were the basis for the global trade of the time, controlled by the Roman Empire. So I did think it was an eerie stretch of the prophetic metaphors of that text, that it recognized that in the embrace with the two beasts of Roman political power is this image of voracious economic power, and already as global. It just seemed to me this bit of prophecy needs to be flowing through our discourses, because it wasn't predicting the 21st century. Prophecy is not prediction, I repeat over and over, but it does seem to be dream reading a pattern that has proved to be tragically deep and gripping and able to be reborn across multiple economic systems through the ages. Thanks for the question. And others.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Let me go on. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and I want to encourage people to feel free to enter questions in the Q&A. This first one is rather long. It's from Arthur Peterson, but I kind of need to read the context. So bear with me. Many thanks for your talk. Your focus on the fruitfulness and openness to creativity of uncertainty is crucially important to get the effect of apocalyptic thinking about climate change right. While I myself have labeled the 1.5 degree target as a pipe dream in the media not long ago, at the time people kept dreaming about it, and there is still the possibility to meet the target. I'm still afraid of the risk of large-scale geoengineering to generate negative emissions, but I was surprised in the past few years to see more and more players in the take climate change seriously. Could you please elaborate a bit more about the role of dreaming in the climate discourse?
Well, thank you. I'd like to hear that the person asking that question, to hear you actually dream a little bit about the role of dreaming in the discourse. And of course, I think you might well be right that the 1.5 is a pipe dream, but I feel it's too dangerous to admit that until we really know that it's true. And otherwise, I'm afraid of motivation sinking and dropping. So, yeah, I suppose the danger of dream reading is that it, excuse me, that it might be tempted to slide a little bit from its dark hope into some optimism. But I think the apocalypse will keep us from going there. The importance, I think, of the dreaming is that it opens up possibilities, right? That it excuse me. It's not COVID, it's an old cough I have. The possibility of dreaming is actually that new possibilities get opened for actualization of changes that we fear are not possible, right? That's that impossible possibility of the im/possible. I think a kind of dream reading or spiritual discipline together that holds us close to the possible is also at the same time keeping us meditating on how close that possibility is to impossibility. That is how close our dreams are to pipe dreams. And so it's very important for some of us to keep the distinction lively between the vibrant dreams that might actually be scientifically informed and the pipe dreams that also might be, but that seem to mislead us in a way that's dangerous now, because it takes away credibility from the struggle. So yeah, we need to stay rigorously realistic, and that is meaning that that the chances are slim for making the changes that we need to make. We keep saying within the decade, and I think that's in less than 10 years, because we've been calling it within the decade for a couple of years. So to make the needed changes within the decade is going to require a depth and an intensity of international cooperation such as there has never been. And it's not impossible that we'll move more in that direction than we seem to be moving. It's not impossible that the positive gestures, like even those of this COP26, which apparently isn't a total cop-out, can do, right? I just want to say the dreams keep us attuned to possibilities that otherwise might get repressed, that allow us to come around to some corner, to find some hope for organizing, for collecting ourselves into stronger networks, for doing better politically than we at this point fear that we can, to just keep those possibilities coming into play at that edge where hope is not going to fall into optimism, but stays edgy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Catherine. Let me make an announcement. If you have your hand up, I cannot see it and we can't call upon you. So somebody like Bob Shabel, who apparently has his hand up, you have to write your question in the Q&A. So please write questions in the Q&A. Don't raise your hand. I can only see 5 people on my screen. Let me go on to the next question. This is by Connie Berthka. Can the work of adaptation and mitigation make a substantial impact without the cooperation of the denialists and the otherworldly optimists? And if their participation is important, how do we reach them? I agree they are probably not here this evening. Do you want me to read it again, or was it clear? Let me read it again one more time. It's a little
Sure, that's great.
Can the work of adaptation and mitigation make a substantial impact without the cooperation of the denialists and the otherworldly optimists? And if their participation is important, how do we reach them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Connie. And no, we actually, in order to do this work, need to be a bigger we than we are, don't we? And so for this work of adaptation and mitigation, and the alleviation of much suffering and the prevention of unbelievably much more to go forward, yes, it can't be just those of us who are already thinking that we're together, finding a ground between between mere denialism and cheap optimism on the one hand and mere nihilism on the other. So I think the reason that it's good that all of us who are gathered here work with religious language in one way or another is that we can directly or indirectly reach into publics who aren't already where we want them to be, right? I think that's the only point. We're not doing the science. I'm just barely holding on to the edges of the science. But what we can do is to communicate with not just communities of faith, but I suppose for a lot of us, first and foremost with communities of faith, but with communities of thinkers, of thinking people, who then who then open up into wider communities. I mean, we need to get our communities of fellow thinkers and activists to be able to communicate more broadly. And I think a lot of that translation work goes on through faith communities, where ancient symbols can be brought into play for motivational purposes. And I do see that happening, quite a bit through the work of some of the religious organizations, some of the churches that I'm part of, and even just the educational work, that there are sub-communities of people who are ethically inclined, but who for very many reasons just don't take climate change seriously or don't take it as their problem. Again, it's not as extreme as people are making out to be, or it's too extreme. There's nothing I can do about it. And I do find that working with religious language is an important motivator and can bring in some metaphors that can be a little more dramatic or a little more appealing, a little more effectual, perhaps in shifting some zones of communal opinion than just the facts, ma'am. But those are particular sub-communities. But a lot of our problem folk are conservative Christians. I can't, in my own work, directly reach many conservative Christians. I don't have that talent, but I am good at talking to and teaching a lot of people who do have that talent, who do actually do a lot of education or ministry with much more conservative communities. So however it is that we find we can get out, anyway, I'm just saying, yes, Connie, we need to have an attitude of compromise about who we're going to be in community with. We don't necessarily want to compromise on the ultimate goal of a just and sustainable planet. But in order to get there, I think we need to find ways to put up with a lot of folk and communicate with a lot of publics who, we might not want to go out for a beer with after the work of the day is done.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Bob had asked the question about whether this would be available and the talk would be available, and we will hear about the recording at the end when Maynard talks. There's a comment or question by James Coots. One of my dissatisfactions with the current science theology dialogue and presentations such as today is the avoidance of the larger cosmic context in which human life has its home. Cosmological data indicates that Earth life will end. It makes no difference how far into the future this end is. Dream reading physics tells me that life requires a lot of energy and that using energy includes entropy. Cosmic entropy and expansion include the end of any life as we know it to the disorder of equilibrium. Why is such a context not respected as the theater of all our human dialogue? Huge time factors should not be an excuse to not face this disclosure. Do you want me-
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, James. Yeah, that's an important question, and I hope I'll answer in a way that at least shows some understanding of it, because I'm not sure that I've got it. But you're wanting us to keep in mind the context of entropy just as cosmic process, and more bluntly that our species is finite, is terminal, right? That at least that's what I'm hearing, that we are not fated to exist everlastingly as a species. So we should incorporate that finitude into our theology, into our conversations with science. That as I'm hearing you, yes, life as we know it will end. Seems to me, yes, that's an important point to make at certain points. I wouldn't want to make it at a point where I'm trying to persuade some nihilistically inclined folk that we might yet have a future we're struggling for. I mean, it might not help to bring in that entropy is going to see to the doom of our species anyway, when we're trying to work to prolong the life and the health of our species, and maybe of a few others too. So, when one is trying to energize work for a long-term future for the multiple species of the earth, including ours, I suppose one isn't emphasizing that it's going to come to an end anyway, but one shouldn't be denying it. So I think the point is not that we will live forever as a species, that we can somehow transcend entropy, however transcendent our faith may be. It would have to be quite supernaturalist to think that, or any transcendence of entropy would have to be couched perhaps in terms of an afterlife or some such symbolic zone. But it seems to me the point is that we can struggle for a much longer term on earth, that just because I know that I'm going to die, probably given my genes, before I'm 100. Probably well before I'm 100. So just because I know I'm going to die, and in the not infinitely distant future, doesn't mean that I don't want to struggle to live on and to do what's in me to do with this life that I share with you and with so many. And so, right, the fact that my life, your life, or the life of the species is finite and captive to larger processes of entropy doesn't make the unfolding of that life less worthwhile. Perhaps it makes it more worthwhile, right? Perhaps because we can't presume that we'll be around forever. Perhaps just because of that, we might appreciate the preciousness of the human experiment now. We might see the importance of ratcheting up our attempts to get to that gradual messianism that the rabbi was talking about. Move on to that world we can just about imagine, that's still flawed but awesome. And that doesn't mean that it on the earth will be endless, will be forever. I don't think the interest in prolonging and enriching our shared life in any way at all denies the processes of entropy, and entropy as crucial to the creativity of the universe and to its its beginningless beginnings and endless ends. I don't know if that gets at your question, but that's what meditation it provokes in me.
Great, thanks, Catherine. This is gonna be the last question, and I'm gonna ask it. And
All right.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best to explain this. It's probably kind of an easy question, but it seems to me that you brought up this idea of chaos, and you brought up the idea of kind of being on the edge of chaos. And I think a lot of times that order of time, order of our lives is kind of a gift to humanity, because humans, we need order to some extent. In fact, when you have to deal with children, that you give them structure, because without structure they fall apart. And so now we find ourselves being put in a world that's chaotic in a way, from an environmental perspective. I mean, weather patterns change, everything is changing. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of balance between order and chaos, and kind of the disbalance about it?
Oh, yes, Gail, I'd love to think with you endlessly about that. But I won't, I promise. Yeah, of course, the notion that arose over the last several decades in chaos and complexity theory about how order unfolds and evolves at the edge of chaos is precisely not about, again, going over the edge into mere chaos. It's not a celebration of chaos, but it does, in as much as the natural science then pushes into an altered cultural and even spiritual understanding. It does help us to appreciate chaos differently. And for me, it was helpful in thinking a little bit differently about the chaos that is, in some sense, the abyss of the divine itself in the beginning of Genesis. So that there are ways of reflecting about the depths of chaos as formless potentiality, and not just order that's fallen apart, which is what we're encountering in our world so much, or forms of conflict between competing orders that just shred to bits meaningful order and leave people desperate to negotiate all the contradictions. So, what seems to me to be the gift of chaos theory is the great beauty of the order of the order that was geometrically figured in fractals, right? I mean, I could just endlessly look at various fractal compositions and just go on and on, finding fractals out in the mountains, in my partner's, pattern of blood veins, in the way the birds are flapping by, in this strange old painting that my mother made, which I won't take off the wall. So yeah, so I just want to say that there's something of a gift that we shouldn't squander from chaos theory in helping us to understand that there's a very precise and complex order that emerges not in chaos, but at that very edge. And it helps us then to resist false orders, totalitarian orders, totalizing orders, orders that push for uniformity, orders that demean difference and complexity. So the capacity of living with what feels like chaos, but not settling for chaos itself, but insisting together on the alternative kinds of order that emerge at that edge. That seems to me what's crucial. You mentioned being a parent, and right, and the problem with needing some order, family with wild kids. I'm just fantasizing a little bit there, but yeah, but of course, good child rearing is that which makes place for a whole lot of complexity, of disorder that doesn't go over that edge into deep chaos, but that opens up the possibility of more rich, more playful, more complex relationships. So it seems to me that in as much as we come to terms with with creation from chaos, we're not blessing chaos as such. Some chaos is sheer destructiveness. Some chaos is sheer aesthetic inspiration. When there's a whole chaos of chaoses that we need to sort ourselves through, and the kind of chaos that I think we want to learn to embrace better, is that which, like the deep resources in each of our own, psychic depths, in our unconscious, in our dream lives, like the deep resources in our spiritual traditions, often hidden over, often confused and chaotic and multiple conflicts with other traditions. But what we want to gather from the richer zones of the chaos of our shared lives seems to me to be the potentialities for emergent, fresh forms of order that don't just need to eliminate past forms of order as though they're too chaotic, but that can work with the ecologies of the world that we have in order to transform it into the world that we hope for, that flawed but awesome one. And I think that flawed but awesome world will have rich explorations always going on at the edge of chaos, at the edge of what is unknown, of what is improbable, what is risky, but perhaps with much greater wisdom. And if we get to that point, and we will have outgrown the sheer waste that makes of the chaos in our world so often something just to be repressed, oppressed, or turns it into garbage, turns much of the planet into chaotic garbage dumps. So to learn to cultivate, to open up the ecologies of complex order seems to me to just require this creative work of
Well, thanks.
walking
Thanks, Catherine.
together there at that edge. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, but I could talk with you for hours about this, but that we don't have time. I wanted to give Fred the chance to make any closing comments you might want to make. Fred?
Honored, thank you. So those last two questions actually have a really interesting connection, because obviously order in the extreme is what we're headed toward 100 billion years from now, or something like that, depending on which version you believe. And sadly, apropos of the entropy question, we have no more than 5 billion habitable years on this earth ahead. The question is, do we even have 50?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a little bit of a let's cross that bridge when we get there. And so both around order and chaos and around entropy, I just want to bring in a multi-religious perspective from Buddhism, the idea of celebrating impermanence, right? That's a whole other approach. From our native brothers and sisters on whose land we are, particularly from the Algonquin Confederacy, the notion of considering 7 generations in the future as a sort of way further than my own life, but not too many bridges to cross, aware that there will be major shifts in the millions and billions of years from now. But my circle of compassion and concern needs to at least extend to those 7. And that is biblical as well. Exodus 34, when Moses wants to better see and understand God describes God's self in 13 revelations. And the last one is that God does not simply wipe away iniquity, but passes the iniquity of the parents on to the children, the children's children, the 3rd and 4th generations. 4 generations is about 100 years. 100 years is about how long the carbon that we emit from the drive that we're going to turn the ignition on tomorrow, that is iniquity based on the structures of which we're a part, that is going to be remitted to our great-great-grandchildren. The good news is by the 7th generation, that carbon has been returned to the deep sea or et cetera, right? And elsewhere in that text, God also says, Notzer chesed la'alafim, extending kindness to the 1000th generation. And that is theological time, which begins to overlap with geological time. Enter Aldo Leopold, land ethic, etc. And if we can get that far, as we say, Dayenu, it will be enough.
Very good. I think that's a good comment to end on. I want to thank our speaker, the respondent. This was just a fabulous session. I'm thrilled.